The sand shifts beneath your feet before you even open your eyes. It is not morning yet, but darkness in ancient Egypt means nothing to you, not anymore. You are a royal guard, a protector of the living God, one of the men chosen to stand between the pharaoh and every threat this world has ever conceived. The title sounds like an honor. The reality is something else entirely. Most people imagine you standing tall in polished armor, spear gleaming, chest proud, holding vigil over a figure of divine perfection. What they do not imagine is what this life actually costs the human body. The hunger, the exposure, the punishment, the silence, the relentless weight of existing inside a system designed to consume you completely. Before this is over, you will understand why the men who surrounded Egypt's living gods were among the most expendable, the most controlled, and the most brutalized figures in the ancient world. And you will never look at the word protection the same way again. Your day begins before the sun clears the horizon. There is no gentle waking, no moment to gather yourself, no warm meal waiting. You rise from whatever surface you were permitted to sleep on, which in most postings meant packed earth, a reed mat if you were fortunate, or the bare stone floor of a guardroom that smelled of sweat, oil, and the particular staleness of too many men in too little space. You do not stretch. You do not linger. Tardiness in the royal household was not an inconvenience. It was an insult to the divine order, and insults to the divine order carried consequences that ranged from public flogging to reassignment to the quarries, which in practice meant a slow and certain death sentence. You had seen it happen to others. You had learned to move before you were fully awake. The physical demands of your role were not what the painting suggested. Those images on tomb walls, the rigid, idealized figures flanking doorways, were theological statements, not honest portraits. The reality of standing guard in ancient Egypt meant enduring hours of absolute stillness in conditions that the human body was never designed to tolerate. In summer, the temperature inside palace corridors and outdoor courtyards could reach levels that made the air itself feel like a living pressure against your skin. You were not permitted to remove your linen kilt, your wig, your sandals, or your weaponry. You were not permitted to sit. You were not permitted to lean. You were not permitted to look directly at the pharaoh unless commanded to do so. You stood, arms at your side, or positioned as protocol demanded, and you endured. Dehydration was a constant companion. Studies of skeletal remains from New Kingdom military populations reveal bone density loss and stress fractures consistent with chronic physical strain, poor nutrition, and repeated episodes of severe dehydration. You were given water, but not freely. Rations in the royal household followed a strict hierarchy, and the men at the bottom of that hierarchy, the lower guards, the outer perimeter soldiers, the night watch, received the least. This was not carelessness. It was intentional. A guard who was slightly hungry, slightly thirsty, slightly uncomfortable was a guard who remained alert through fear and physical agitation rather than through comfort. The system understood human psychology with a coldness that still feels modern. The weapons you carried were not decorative. A spear, a shield, a bronze or copper-tipped weapon depending on your rank and the era of your service. These were working tools, and you were expected to demonstrate proficiency with them regularly. Training was not voluntary. Men who failed physical evaluations were reassigned, and reassignment rarely meant something better. The Royal Guard was a competitive institution, and the competition was not friendly. Your fellow guards were your brothers and your rivals simultaneously, because advancement in the pharaoh's personal protection detail depended on a combination of performance, loyalty, physical condition, and the kind of favor that had nothing to do with merit. Men disappeared from the roster without explanation. You learned not to ask. What almost no one tells you is the psychological architecture of serving a living God. The pharaoh was not a man you were protecting. The pharaoh was a theological fact. a cosmic mechanism, the pivot point between the human world and the divine order that kept the Nile flooding, the crops growing, and chaos from consuming everything. This was not poetry. This was the actual belief system that governed your entire reality, and it meant that your relationship to the person you guarded had no human dimension at all. You did not speak to the pharaoh unless spoken to. You did not make eye contact. You did not respond to him as you would respond to any other human being. The protocols surrounding the pharaoh's body, the way he was approached, addressed, touched, or attended, were so elaborate and so rigidly enforced that violations, even accidental ones, could end careers or end lives. There is a particular darkness in this that takes time to understand. You were protecting something you were not permitted to truly see. The intimacy of the role, standing close enough to hear breathing, close enough to feel the air move when the God King raised an arm, existed in permanent tension with the absolute prohibition against genuine human contact. Some guards served their entire careers within arm's reach of the most powerful person in the known world and never once exchanged a real word with him. You were an extension of the palace architecture, a breathing wall, a living door. The inner guard, those assigned to the pharaoh's sleeping quarters, bathing chambers, and private spaces, faced a particular version of this erasure. Access to the most intimate spaces of the royal household came with the most severe restrictions. Papyrus records and administrative documents from sites including Deir el-Medina and the New Kingdom Palace complexes reveal a bureaucratic obsession with controlling who entered which areas, when they entered, what they carried, and how long they remained. Men assigned to the inner guard were sometimes required to demonstrate their loyalty through physical alterations. Historical records and iconographic evidence suggest that certain palace attendants, including some categories of guards in the deepest household levels, were subjected to procedures designed to eliminate any possibility of unauthorized access to the royal family. The body was not entirely your own once you entered the pharaoh's household. Outside the palace, your exposure multiplied. When the pharaoh traveled, and the pharaohs of the New Kingdom traveled extensively, moving between Memphis and Thebes and Heliopolis, conducting military campaigns, overseeing construction projects, attending festivals. The guard traveled with him. This meant exposure to sun and sand and insects and disease at a scale that the palace walls had at least partially buffered. Desert travel in ancient Egypt was genuinely lethal for the unprepared, and even the prepared died from it regularly. You carried your equipment, which was heavy. You marched at the pace required by the procession or campaign, which was relentless. You ate what was available, which during extended travel often meant dried fish, hardened bread full of grit from the grinding stones, and water from sources that ranged from tolerable to actively dangerous. Studies of ancient Egyptian skeletal remains show dental wear consistent with a lifetime of consuming grit-contaminated food. The kind of slow, grinding damage that built up over years of eating bread made with stone-ground grain that always carried particles of quartz and limestone into every meal. Disease moved through military and guard populations with efficiency. Ancient Egypt's environment, for all its grandeur, was a remarkably fertile breeding ground for parasitic infection, bacterial illness, and the kind of chronic conditions that never fully resolved, but simply became part of the background texture of existence. Schistosomiasis, caused by parasitic flatworms thriving in the Nile's irrigation channels and standing water, affected a significant portion of the population. Evidence found in mummified remains shows infection rates that suggest this was not an occasional misfortune, but a near-universal condition for people who worked outdoors near water. Your skin itched. Your abdomen hurt with a consistency that you had long since stopped interpreting as a warning sign, and had simply absorbed as your permanent physical state. Think about the last time you took a pill for a headache, swallowed a tablet that cleared up an infection in 7 days, or visited a professional who understood what was wrong with your body. None of that existed. What existed was a combination of herbal remedies, ritual interventions, and the hope that your body's own resistance would outlast whatever had gotten into it. The threat you were most trained to address was also the one you were least likely to ever face directly. Actual physical assassination attempts on the pharaoh were rare, well documented in their rarity, and almost entirely conducted by insiders rather than external enemies. The conspiracy against Rameses III, recorded in what scholars now call the Harem Conspiracy Papyri, revealed with extraordinary specificity how the most dangerous threat to the living god came from within his own household. Men in positions of trust, women in the inner chambers, officials with access. The people closest to the divine body were also the people most capable of destroying it, and the guard structure that surrounded the pharaoh was therefore as much a tool of internal surveillance as external defense. You watched the servants, you watched the officials, you watched each other. The system you served needed you to be simultaneously loyal, suspicious, obedient, and alert. A psychological combination that ground people down over years into something flatter and harder and less human than what they had been when they arrived. When guards failed, when they slept during duty, allowed unauthorized entry, missed a threat, or were implicated in any irregularity, the response was not proportional. Surviving legal papyri from the New Kingdom show cases in which guards received punishments including severe flogging, mutilation, and execution for violations that in any other context would have been classified as minor infractions. The logic was theological rather than judicial. A failure of protection was not just a professional failure, it was a cosmic failure. It was an act of chaos introduced into the divine order. The punishment matched that framing, not the practical severity of what had actually happened. You could lose your nose and ears, a documented punishment in Egyptian legal records for falling asleep on watch. The physical mark of your failure would be visible on your face for the rest of whatever life remained to you. The men who survived long careers in the Royal Guard survived by developing a kind of total psychological adaptation to the system. They stopped thinking in terms of their own preferences, their own comfort, their own safety. Those categories had no useful application in the world they inhabited. What replaced them was a radical attentiveness to the environment, to the hierarchy, to the shifting politics of the household, and to the physical needs of the divine body they were assigned to preserve. This was not resilience in any modern therapeutic sense. It was erasure. The men who served the living God longest were often the men who had most completely dissolved the parts of themselves that were inconvenient to the role. Now think about your morning. The moment you pressed a button, and water appeared at exactly the temperature you wanted. The moment you opened a refrigerator and chose from 15 different options for breakfast. The moment you closed a door behind you and were alone without consequence, without surveillance, without the theological weight of a cosmic order resting on whether your posture was correct. You did none of those things consciously. You took all of them for granted because you have never lived in a world where the body was a tool owned by something larger than yourself, managed by a system that had no interest in your comfort, your individuality, or your survival beyond its own requirements. The men who protected ancient Egypt's living gods lived and died inside exactly that world. And the brutal truth is that the grandeur you see in the monuments, the temples, the golden masks, the overwhelming visual language of divine power, all of it was partially built on the compressed and exhausted lives of men who never got to decide how to stand, what to eat, when to rest, or whether they were worth more than the wall they had been positioned to replace. If there is a place, a civilization, a court, a ritual, or a hidden corner of history that you think deserves this same kind of unfiltered reconstruction, the reality behind the version that made it into the textbooks, tell us in the comments. The history that gets left out is usually the most important part.